It is my absolute exquisite pleasure, Harold. Thank you for inviting me. Well, I am devastatingly handsome. No, I was born in Guyana. That's our connection. You're from Trinidad. I'm from Guyana. I left when I was a small child, grew up mostly in Toronto, a little bit in New York. Um, I have a background in writing and in epidemiology. So I have two parallel careers, one as an author, the other as a scientist. And I think for the purposes of this conversation, we're going to be exploring possibly both of those careers. But at a more official level, I'm a professor at the University of Ottawa in health sciences, mostly an educator. And during the worst of the COVID pandemic, I think most people got to know me as a face on the news talking about COVID and its implications. That's right. Yeah. Right. There's a lot to unpack there. You said a lot of stuff. Um, First, I'll try hard not to show my political bias, and we all have a bias, right? I'll try to be as fair as I possibly can. I will say the nature of the Westminster parliamentary system makes it such that we have this scenario, and I think it's a good scenario. And by that, I'm talking about your comment earlier about how Prime Minister Carney was brought into power through the election by 150,000 or so members of the Liberal Party. So the nature of the Westminster parliamentary system, of which we are a member, and other what's what I'm looking for, other former British protectorates are also of this nature, is is elected officials self organize to form governments. So everyone who sits in parliament was elected, and then they self organize by virtue of their affiliations to form government. Hence, we have a liberal government because they were the plurality of the seats. And the party who forms government can choose their own leader by whatever process they deem appropriate. And they have deemed this individual to be their leader, hence, he is prime minister. And it's happened before in our history. Kim Campbell famously was the conservative prime minister without being elected, right? But she had a seat at least. So it's not. This is not unheard of. It's not an anti-democratic process. The stepping down by Justin Trudeau, I predicted this months before he did so, because it was the obvious thing to do. There is so much ill will associated with his name for whatever reason. And I personally believe that a lot of that reason was unfounded. I think if I ask people directly, why don't you like Justin Trudeau? It has more to do with his personality than with his policies, although there are some valid criticisms of policy as well. So by stepping down, suddenly the party was given renewed shot in the arm, a vitamin B12 injection almost, because the greatest source of discontentment with the party was in fact his leadership. And absent him, suddenly there's no obvious reason to dislike the party. Then you have this shoe in the works, which is Mr. Trump, who represents an unprecedented challenge to the norms of rational government. And by presenting this existential external threat to Canadian sovereignty, suddenly, of course, Canadians are compelled to rally around a message of sovereign unity, and that is best represented by the ruling party. And that also opens the door for an old school, white collar, somewhat elitist individual in the form of a former banker to take on the reins. I think about, in any other era, would we be celebrating the rise of a banker to this role? Right? But yet, that seems to be the ideal person in these times of unprecedented economic chaos. There is a perception that the best person equipped to navigate through these rough waters is someone whose life was spent in finance. That is Mr. Carney, apparently. So it is an interesting time, and it seems like the stars have aligned for his ascendancy. And by no means not guaranteed. I mean, frankly, I think it's quite possible that we might have a minority conservative government. That's always possible, despite the polls saying otherwise. So who knows what will happen? But these are interesting times, absolutely. Yeah. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, 100%. I agree. And what we're looking at here is the fundamental Achilles heel of most Western governments, which is we only plan 4 to 5 years in the future, which is the election cycle. Right? We plan how much can we accomplish to show the public that we're doing something for the next election cycle. To plan 10, 15, 20 years in advance is unheard of anymore. The Chinese do it because they're going to be in power for decades to come. And the Russians do it to some extent, given the nature of their leadership. We don't do that. So given the short timeline for planning, it makes sense, or it did in the past, to rely heavily on this obvious, enormous, friendly market to our south. It was a place of great wealth for us. We can sell our products there relatively easily and advantageously, even given our differences in currency valuation. No one anticipated that market would be suddenly closed to us. So, in retrospect, in hindsight, of course, it made perfect sense to cultivate better internal trade and better relationships with partners abroad. But in fairness, no one saw this coming. But now that sorry, go on. I was going to say, but now that we do see the threat, and the fact of the matter is, we're never going back to any normal relationship with the USA, at least not in my lifetime. That everyone is scrambling to create new relationships and new robustness against further perturbations. And that's a difficult thing to do when you've been trained to think about things in a certain norm over the past 80 years, frankly. So devising new norms is the challenge, and I'm thankful that I'm not the one making these decisions because I'm not creative enough or smart enough to figure that out. Yeah, 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 yeah. Oh, totally. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's again a further Achilles heel of the Westminster system, which I just spent some time congratulating and celebrating. One of the failures of the Westminster system is the necessity of an official opposition. So they're always going to criticize; they're never going to help, which is a problem, right? Um, um, yeah. So speaking of this short-term planning, which I think is a big problem, when government does miraculously engage in some semblance of long term planning, often it is incomplete long term planning. I'll give you an example. I think the Trudeau government's decision to increase immigration was founded on some good ideas. And the good idea was, we're looking at what I call a demographic cliff. The aging of our population means we will not have enough people to sustain payments into our social security system. So we need more people because we're not reproducing ourselves. But that increased immigration came without thinking about the implications of increased immigration, like housing demands, like healthcare demands, like the cultural stresses that it would cause. So those things are fairly obvious if you stopped and thought about it. So, on the one hand, yay, you thought about this economic cliff that we're looking at, and you made investments now that will pay dividends 20 years hence when we're looking at an insufficiency of working age people. On the other hand, oh my goodness, you created economic chaos by doing it all right now. So, I guess what I'm trying to say is yeah, we have this problem with short term planning. We have a further problem with an, an anemic, shallow, insufficient long term planning that often is chaotic and destructive. So, what I would like to see is more mature, comprehensive, well thought out long term planning. And I think a mature, proper government is able to do that. Yeah, yeah. Oh, this is obviously true. And we've been looking at a problem with this for the last 20, 30, even 40 years, where increasingly the most desirable leaders in society are not being pursued for leadership roles. And one of the reasons for that is there are improper incentives for the best and brightest to seek public office, and a lot of disincentives for them not to seek public office. And furthermore, a lot of incentives for the worst people to seek public office. If you look at right now, I have a lot of respect for sitting MPs, amazingly, not because of their smartness or their ethics. It's because of the nonsense that they put up with on a day to day basis, more so now than 5 years ago or even 10 years ago. walking from their parliamentary office to their vehicle now or across the street is fraught with terror, with people yelling at them. Yeah, and this never used to be the case where you could actually step out and have a life. And now they come for their children, they come for their homes. I mean, I've been approached by all three parties to run to some extent, over the past number of years. And I gave it some thought. I would never consider it now. Never. It's not worth the stress or the actual disruption in your life, and frankly, the genuine threat to your well-being. So until we as a society invest in proper civic behavior of everybody, you are never going to see the best and brightest aspire to office ever again. Because if you're smart enough to aspire to office, you're smart enough to know this is not a good thing. Yeah. No, we have a problem with journalism. Like, I have a lot of respect for journalists, but the questions they're asking are to some extent, yeah. But during the pandemic, I had a lot of engagement with journalists, and I complain about the amount of nonsense I dealt with from anti-vaxxers and other people. The journalists dealt with a lot more and a lot more threats, especially the women and minorities. Um, so I'm sympathetic to their plight. However, these days the questions they ask are simple and more like, "Do you agree with this? Do you agree?" It's yes or no answers, never anything probing, and worse, the politicians disrespect them so much that they just wave them away and choose not to answer this. And we have situations where some politicians will only deal with reporters that are sympathetic. Now, the entire journalistic corps should see that and refuse to deal with that individual or give them bad coverage if they see it. There should be some sort of cohesiveness of almost a union like environment for reporters to bring back respect for the office. And that has to come one day, or the entire institution of media is jeopardized. Yeah. Man, if I had the answers to all this, I'd be a rich man. I have answers to nothing. I think, I mean, I do have some ideas. I think a lot of the problems, a lot of the solutions, though, are society level solutions. Individual institutions can only do so much. Individual politicians can only do so much. So, from the ground up, as a people, we have to make a decision. A, we want civil society back. And by that, I mean people acting and behaving civilly again. It's not supposed to be okay to act boorishly. It's not supposed to be okay. Yeah. Mm, yeah. 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 It's very complex. So at the federal level, during the Trudeau years, two bills were passed. I think C-48 and C-78, if I got the numbers correctly. One of them effectively made it easier to get bail by removing some discriminations, which was an interesting, human rights perspective, but it effectively made it easier to get bail. The other law made it harder to get bail because it put the onus on seeking of bail on the accused rather than other people. Um, so the levers are being played with all the time. I don't know what the appropriate legal path is, but there has to be consistency of application. So the fundamental principle of justice is everyone must be treated the same, like and like. And if you're not perceiving that, then we have a fundamental problem with society. And we have an issue I mean, the biggest, not the biggest issue in Canada, but one of the laughable aspects of Canada is the extent to which we have jurisdictional issues, federal versus provincial versus municipal. And it's hard to understand which applies where. We've got serious crimes are federal, we have less serious crimes are provincial, we've got minor crimes are municipal, and yet everyone gets mad at the politician that you recognize, regardless of whether or not they're responsible for that particular issue. Yeah, yeah. Part of the problem is constitutional limits. So constitutionally, health, for example, is a provincial mandate, and if you make attempts to have a sort of federal control over health beyond the military and beyond Indigenous people, you're going to run into problems. Same with education. Education is a provincial mandate. Housing is a provincial mandate. There are all kinds of calls to make some sort of federal anti-homelessness legislation. It's difficult when you run up against the Constitution, and the Constitution is there for reasons. I'm not a lawyer. Maybe it's not the Constitution. Maybe it's the BNA Act, but something to do with the founding documentation of our nation. And yes, all these things can be changed with incredible political effort. Even looking back at the repatriation of the Constitution under the first Trudeau years, not everything that was desired was achieved via unanimous consent. Quebec resisted on several fronts. And so we still have a fractured constitution because we could not achieve unanimity. Meech Lake was an attempt to fix some of those issues, and it failed as well. So we're never going to get unanimity. And now, given the truly fractured nation of Canadian society, more so than ever before, it is impossible to render a sufficient number of votes to change things constitutionally. Always, always. You know why? Because we are still among the wealthiest nations in the world. We are still ranked amongst the top 10, if not five, and sometimes top three happiest nations in the world. If you look at the Human Development Index, we are always in the running for being one of the most content and well developed societies in the world. People aspire to be us. And it's easy to look around and see things that are bad. And there are lots of things that are bad. But in general, compared to the rest of the world, we're fine. There's another quote. I always tell my students this. Um, Obama once asked at a speech, if you couldn't pick your gender or your race, where and when would you like to live? And he says, if you know what's good for you, your answer will be here and now. But he was talking about the USA, but the same applies to Canada. So any other time in history, if you're born a woman, oh, good God, you're if you're born a non-white person, good God, you're in trouble. So, but right now, despite all the problems we have, you have a strong expectation of being treated fairly under the law. You have a strong expectation of people like you and me being non-white immigrants to this country, aspiring to wealth and privilege, or some degree of comfort. And we have a fair expectation that our children can rise up in society. That is not guaranteed in most places in the world. So it's right. Right. So now, I've said that part. I'm deeply troubled by some of the trajectories here. I think the biggest challenge to the fabric of our society right now is, in fact, misinformation and disinformation. That is the fundament of all the challenges we have. We can fix anything if we can only agree on what facts are. If we can't agree on what facts are, we're in deep trouble. Well, yes. Yeah, I've thought, but first of all, it is possible to fix. The deliberate state mandated disinformation is actually fairly easily fixed. We saw this during the early days of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, when Twitter shut down the Russian accounts and some of the Belarusian accounts, and instantly, a lot of the COVID misinformation dried up. For people like me who were being assaulted every day online, that just stopped magically. So you know right away where it's coming from, right? Mm, I see. Yeah, I haven't looked into that, so I don't know for sure what's happening there. But the disinformation issue, I mean, there's a disinformation part, which is mostly um, mediated by governments and wealthy individuals. So that can be targeted, and then there are useful idiots who take that information and run with it. That stuff you can combat with just flooding the airways with proper information. The problem there, though, is you can't have government do it because then you're seen as just a propagandist arm, and you have to be on the lookout not to be propagandist of any kind. So what you need are citizens organizing around shared assumptions of truth and shouting down naysayers. Yeah, the government is involved propagandistically, no question. Especially in the U.S. right now, with the government of Florida with their nonsensical. Uh, yeah, yeah. There's all kinds of foreign interference. There's no question, and that has to be addressed too. And with foreign interference stuff, we can inoculate the public against all kinds of bad ideas with sufficient education. But not just in schools, though. It's got to start from the societal level upward, and it's got to start with civic education. People understanding what their responsibilities are and what the roles of all the players in their institutions are. Too many Canadians get their civic education from American crime dramas that talk about the Fifth Amendment rights and things, but we don't have, that's no relationship to Canada. So we have to reinvest in educating Canadians about the nature of Canadian society, how to find proper information, and then if there is foreign interference in pushing, it almost doesn't matter because we can see through it. Yeah. No. Hmm. 100%, 100%. And I miss the days when competing political parties can nevertheless agree that what they want is a betterment of society and whatever is best for the Canadian public. Somehow that seems to have been lost, and now we have individuals seeking their own personal betterment. So somehow we have filters in place that are selecting for almost sociopathic and psychopathic individuals, especially in the U.S. You know, so that's. But again, yeah. Go on. Go on. I think all the data is suggesting a liberal majority. I think that's a bit. Uh, I suspect it's going to be a liberal minority. But I'm not very good at making predictions like this. I'm always wrong. So I don't think it does. I think rally size is irrelevant. Uh, Yeah, and I don't see in the Polyev camp any sort of compelling policies that are ringing with the Canadian population. If there are, compelling policies, they're not making it into the conversation. What's making it into the conversation is petty things like insulting people's haircuts and things like that, or fighting with reporters. I would like people. I think the Canadian voters are looking for actual substantive policies to compare. And to Carney's benefit, he has the power of the prime minister's office, so he can roll out policy all the time. To a large extent, yeah. I think a lot of people are looking for how the new prime minister can handle President Trump. And I mean, Mark Carney has the advantage of having already done so to some extent, and we don't know what Polyev would do. I do bristle though at this tendency of Canadian voters to look at who the prime minister will be. I mean, again, it's the Westminster parliamentary system. We're electing a government of representatives, not one man. It's not the American system. 100%. Less so than the Americans. But the gap between the two is much less so than the in the US. Yeah. And fashion and sports. And it's my pleasure. Thank you so much. Thank you. Okay.